Yesterday, I went to talk to one of the ANU academics about my PhD, and as it's quite relevant, I told them a lot about my autism, the anxiety attacks, how it relates to the process of being supervised. At the end of the discussion, they commented that I was quite courageous to be telling them all this when it's possible that people could react really poorly, and they were asking me why it was that I felt confident that it would be okay to do this. I guess, and I've been thinking about this a lot since then, I think it comes down to the fact that I've now disclosed autism to a lot of people, and I've got a pretty good idea of what to look for to predict their reaction. The most important thing about most of my autism disclosures is it's to people who already know me. It's pretty rare that I rock up to strangers in the street and say, "Hi Ruth, I'm Ruth, I'm autistic." So what usually happens is there's a pattern like this. I tell them I'm autistic and they think, and you can almost see it going through their mind. Ruth, Sheldon Cooper, or whoever they're thinking of as an example of an autistic person. Back to me. Not much in common. And then they could say something like, "I don't know much about autism." And I should say that this is the best possible response. There's nothing wrong with ignorance, but thinking you're knowledgeable when you're not is a real problem. The biggest problem I've actually found with autism disclosures is not for family, friends, or colleagues. It's when I go to a doctor or a psychologist. Because in those circumstances, the first thing they find out about me is a referral letter that goes something like this. "Dear Dr. Blah, this is Ruth. She's autistic and having difficulties at work. Please tell us what you think. Kind regards, Dr. Blah." And so here's some of the things that psychologists and other doctors have told me in response to what they think and why someone with autism would be having difficulty at work. "You are incapable of empathy. This multiple choice for people with autism proves it. You are mistaking professional friendliness for friendship. This is common in autism. The job you are doing is too demanding for someone with autism. You are having a breakdown because you left home when you were 17 and this was too demanding for someone with autism." Then, after they tell me what they think, there always seems to be a pause in these conversations when they turn around and check whether I'm upset. And at which point, they finally stop talking for long enough for me to start telling them what I think. And so I have to respond with something like, "No, I'm not upset. I just think you're wrong. Here is why I think your conclusions are not supported by the evidence." Now, to be clear, the "I'm not upset" bit is incorrect. I was actually both upset and simultaneously thought they were wrong for a good evidence-based reason. However, it seemed to me that they were having a bit of a struggle with the theory of my autistic mind, and in particular the idea that I could be a capable functioning person in many circumstances, perfectly capable of making my own life decisions and understanding why I was at the appointment, but also have difficulties in other areas. So given that's where they were, I thought that the idea that you could be both upset and capable of rational thought at the same time might be a bit much to expect. And at this point, because I've put forward an evidence-based scholarly argument refuting their claims and what they think is going on, they actually start listening to me. And finally, we might actually get on to what I'm looking for. But unfortunately, this usually comes towards the end of the appointment. Now, as you can probably tell, I don't particularly have fond memories of these encounters or a particularly high level of regard for the individuals involved. But the thing that keeps getting me and really makes me angry about them, and I'm not sure why it's this in particular, is the idea of payment. That I have to go in and pay them money to educate them about the assumptions they're making in their interactions with me, knowing full well that the reason I'm able to do this is because of the scholarly approach I learnt through my PhD, and particularly the area of research that was into teacher-student interactions and understanding the assumptions that are going on there. So what I actually have is a large number of interactions with people in which I disclose autism. Essentially, it's a large sample of qualitative data. And going through and analysing it, there's a pretty basic pattern. For the people who know me, they find out I'm autistic, they compare what they know about me to the assumptions about autism, and then they conclude that at least some of their assumptions about autism are flawed. On the other hand, we have people who only know I'm autistic and don't know anything else about me. They see everything I tell them through the lens of their assumptions about autism. They then say things that I find upsetting based on their assumptions. And so then I have to critique their assumptions. And in doing so, they actually start listening. And when they start listening, they actually learn things about me, not just see their own assumptions about autism. And then we can jump back into the previous process. They can compare what they know about me to their assumptions about autism, and they can eventually reach the conclusion that some of their assumptions about autism are flawed. So looking at this, it really strikes me, wouldn't it be great if doctors and psychologists could somehow get to know me before I go and consult with them and have to tell them I'm autistic? If there was some way that they could be convinced of what I'm good at before we talk about the difficulties that I face. Unfortunately, that's not normally the case. And so what I have to do instead is essentially prepare for my doctor's appointments like it's a job interview, working out how to introduce myself and drop a few of my qualifications, a few of the things I'm good at, casually into the conversation so I can make that point, and then they can treat me as a sensible person who they should listen to and who has lots of ideas about what's going on. So these doctors and psychologists are meant to be experts. Where are all these unhelpful assumptions coming from? And I think the issue here is that when you look at the areas of autism that have got lots of research, it's males and not females. It's children and not adults. It's the deficits and not the strengths. It's observable behaviour, not the inner experience. That's looking at interventions and therapies specifically for people with autism, not adjustments to mainstream learning or employment. And so when you look at the areas that aren't getting much research, they're starting to look a lot like me. Now I want to be clear that not all psychologists I've seen have been like the examples I just described. Some of them have been incredibly helpful. And I think these are the psychologists that understand the limitations of the research that has been conducted. Just like my friends and family are doing the comparison to Sheldon Cooper or whoever and realising I'm not like any of the autistic people they've heard of before, they're comparing it to the research conducted and realising that I'm not like the people who've been studied in that research, and that therefore the things they've learnt in class, in professional development from papers, might not actually apply to me. Now I tried to do a similar slide to describe the sort of things that these psychologists are saying, but I couldn't come up with words very easily. And that's when I realised that the reason for this is because they weren't actually doing that much talking. The main thing that characterises my interactions with them is that they were listening. And then not only were they listening, they were thinking. And after the listening and the thinking, every now and again they would suggest something that I could look into. And because they'd listened and thought, most of the time it was a really helpful suggestion. So I better add in a third group to my analysis of people who only know I'm autistic but are also excellent listeners. And they listen. And then they can go on and compare what they know about me to assumptions about autism and get to the conclusion that their assumptions about autism are flawed. Now, in terms of the question that I was asked, how did I feel confident that bad things weren't going to happen? That's actually mainly because of what I know about myself. I know that I can critique their assumptions if they start to make them, and I can usually do so well that they acknowledge that I've made a valid point and start rethinking their assumptions and listening to what I'm saying. To show you what I mean by this, let's start with another thing that psychologists and other people have said to me. I can't do theory of mind. Right? But I thought I could. Now, when they dump this on me during an appointment, I have to think on my feet the best I can. You see what I was saying about it, needing to prepare like it's a job interview. But in this case, making this video, I thought I'd take the opportunity to actually do a little bit of research. So I did a quick search and came up with this article. I was actually just interested in the introduction and review of the literature, not the findings of the article. So I just grabbed the first one I found that was quite recent and looked sensible. So what they're saying here, first of all, that interest, is how humans deal with this challenging task, that is, making sense of the behaviour of others, is still an unresolved question. So my first thought is that if it's an unresolved question in research, maybe it's a little bit early to be making conclusive statements to me that I can't do it. The other thing we have is this definition or summary of what it's involved, and my little skim reading found similar sort of explanations elsewhere. So we got the idea that theory of mind is all about understanding and predicting the behaviour of others, which involves attributing or inferring feelings, intentions and beliefs from observable cues. Now, for my PhD research, I was developing a theory of decision-making during teacher-student interactions. And since that time, I've sort of thought about how you could apply it more broadly. You can start with my standard teacher-student interactions I was imagining, but you can also imagine the student taking over as teacher. We can define teacher and student far more broadly than someone who's paid to be a classroom teacher to someone else. And then there are the non-teaching interactions, where you build positive relationships that turn out to be really important to the teaching. It's true, it doesn't cover all interactions. Romantic interactions in particular are not covered because they're generally pretty frowned on in a teacher-student context. But looking at the interactions it does cover is quite a lot. And what did it do? Well, it was understanding and predicting, check, the behaviour of others, including attributing and inferring, feelings, intentions, belief, yep, and yep, based on observable cues. It would seem to me that my PhD research was pretty much a theory of mind. However, inevitably, this is when I get told, we're not talking about that sort of theory of mind. So this is where this idea of a two systems framework comes into play. One of these systems involves making explicit representations of other people's mental states and beliefs. That means consciously thinking about what they're thinking and feeling. And they're thought to be cognitively demanding, reflective and slow. Now, this is the way that I do theory of mind when it comes to neurotypicals, and let me tell you, it is cognitively demanding, requires a lot of reflection, and it's slow. The other system they're talking about is via implicit processes. That means we don't necessarily realise that we're doing it, that are automatic, immediate and reflex-like. It involves looking at things like the vocalization, the facial expression, the gaze direction, and the body motion. So this is where we start talking about making eye contact, looking at facial cues, that sort of thing. And yes, this is not something I do well. I typically avoid eye contact as much as possible, particularly when I'm thinking a lot myself. And I do know that I've really struggled to work out what a neurotypical is feeling by looking at their eyes. So this is usually when they start talking about how relying on cognitively demanding, reflective, slow processes is really difficult when you need to make quick responses during conversations. Too right it is. I know all about that. That's why I hate conversations when you have to make quick responses. So this is what they use to justify their claims that the intuitive processes are better somehow, because you can use them to make snap judgments. But this is really looking at it from the point of view of the person who is making the snap judgments, and not the point of view of the person that is having snap judgments made of them. So here is my experience of what it's like when people make those snap, intuitive, automatic judgments of what I'm thinking and feeling. They'll pick up on some aspect of my body language, and they usually seem to conclude that I'm upset, and then possibly, certainly without telling me, and possibly without even being aware of it themselves, they make changes in how they're communicating or interacting with me based on that conclusion. The problem is that most of the time I'm not actually upset. What's really going on is that my brain is going into overdrive using those cognitively demanding, reflective, slow processes to run a theory of the neurotypical mind that explains bizarre conversational shifts based on a flawed understanding of my autistic mind. Now, I don't know what they're observing because I can't observe it myself. I haven't seen a video, and even if I happen to, say, be on Skype or Zoom at the same time, there's no brain left over to observe what I look like. But I'm pretty sure that the issue is that in order to run those slow, in inverted comma, processes during a normal conversation, my brain is triggering a stress response to give me a processing boost. And they're observing the body language signs of the stress response, and including that it's being triggered because I'm upset by the conversation, not in response to the processing demands. So the problem with these conversations, particularly when it's going to a professional like a doctor or psychologist, is not that it's harmful for me, it's that it's really demanding and isn't achieving anything useful. All it's doing is I'm using a lot of brain power to try and keep track of all their assumptions and then trying to correct as many as I can. So when I realise this is starting to happen, I just conclude it's time to find a new psychologist. And what I'm looking for is someone who understands that the automatic theory of mind doesn't work across neurodiversity. It works because we can assume that people who have a brain like us exhibit the similar sort of body language cues, tone of voice when they're thinking and feeling to we do. So we can interpret it that way. When the person doesn't do that, it ends up with all sort of cross-communication going on. And I want someone who, instead of using the automatic theory of mind, is really excellent at using the reflective slow theory of mind. Now, the best way to find out which theory of mind people use is to tell them you're autistic and see how they respond. However, I've also realised through having had so many of these conversations that I'm starting to be able to predict how people will react before I've actually told them I'm autistic. And reading through the paper, I picked up on something really interesting. They were saying that the explicit process of mind reading are cognitively demanding, I knew that bit, and they heavily depend on language and reasoning ability. If I add my own observation that listening ability is super, super important, I think I'm actually picking up on those three precise things and using it to make predictions. So what I think I'm doing in pretty much all my conversations, just in the background without really realising it, is doing what I'm going to call Ruth's theory of mind assessment. That is this person, assuming they're a neurotypical, able to use the slow reflective processes that would allow them to come to terms with and come up with a decent theory of my autistic mind. So I'm looking for signs that they're avoiding the automatic processes. So there's no theory of my mind failures, and I notice these they really stand out. And also they're not jumping in quickly, but they're taking time to think things through. Then, to be good at this slow reflective theory, they want to be an excellent listener, strong at the nuances of language, and a strong reasoning ability. If I observe these things, it's not just that it's unlikely to be negative consequences of me talking to them and disclosing my autism, but it would actually turn out to have positive benefits of me going to the effort of doing that.